We cannot build houses. We cannot get the infrastructure of building because, as everyone knows, Syria has sanctions, and the United States and the Western and the world community only lift the sanctions of 180 days. No country on planet Earth can build houses and buildings for 5.5 million people, Syrian people who are homeless because of the sanctions, because of the war, and because of the American military being illegally in the east of Syria and stealing the oil and stealing the gas and stealing the wheat. Syria's having to import the wheat for bread, having to import the oil and gas, also to turn for cooking gas and to turn on the electricity and for cars.
I saw 3 villages that they don't have schools anymore. They just don't have schools anymore. Those children, they could be the next Albert Einstein, or they could be a very important people for us, for humans. But now what? Maybe they will become the new wave of jihadists going to Europe or going to anywhere. What we are facing now in Syria is not because of the earthquake itself. And we can't put all of our problem on the earthquake. What our real problem is the sanctions itself.
We're told that we're fighting a war on terror, but we're not. We're closely allied with terrorists like Al-Qaeda in an endless quest to destroy Arab civilizations throughout the Middle East. The West loves the terrorists that the people of Syria despise.
Everyone who died in the earthquake, his blood is on us and on humanity. Anyone who could be survived, but we couldn't be there to help, we were the killers.
Hello everyone, welcome to Talk It Out with me, Li Jingjing. This show aims to show you the different voices and stories from China and the rest of the global south, especially the voices that are often neglected by the Western mainstream media. It has been more than a week since the devastating earthquake struck Turkey and Syria. By the time we are recording this program, the death toll in the two countries climbed to about 40,000 combined, and that number is expected to continue to grow. Now, what's also urgent is providing shelter, food, schooling, and psychosocial cares for the people that are affected by the earthquake. The international community has sent rescue teams and assistance to the earthquake-hit regions. But the situation for Syria is a bit complicated. Already a war-torn country, Syria has suffered from numerous Western sanctions. The fact that lacking of food, electricity, fuel, and other necessities has further worsened the situation. After repeated requests from the international community, the United States decided to suspend the sanctions on Syria for 180 days and allegedly will let assistance in with less obstacles. But will this help solve the dire situation that Syria is facing? What does it feel like to live under Western sanctions? And what led to the crisis in Syria? Joining me today are guests from Syria, sharing their experience. Joining me now from Latakia is Stephen Sahiounie, Syrian-American freelance journalist and chief editor of Mideast Discourse. He's based in Latakia, a region that was affected by the earthquake. Joining me from Aleppo is Madkis. He's a photographer, the founder of Warsaw Production House. He has traveled through different cities these days to help the earthquake survivors. So, Stephen, let me go to you first. We know Latakia is one of the cities being affected by the earthquake. So tell us, how did you feel when the earthquake hit, and what is the situation in Latakia now?
When the earthquake hit, it was 4:30 a.m. So I was asleep, but I felt like the whole bed was rocking like a ship. I immediately jumped, and I stood under a door, because they always say stand under a bridge. I figured out that it's an earthquake, but I felt like the floor under me was dancing. At the same time, it was a storm was hitting, a storm that we never lived through maybe in the last 10, 15 years. So it was the storm and the earthquake at the same time. people were in the streets in their nightgowns. The Syrian government and the ministries and the branches, they are doing their best. They have committees of engineers going from building to building, checking it if it's livable or not. There's a lot of buildings they're emptying them from the people because it's unlivable. The Syrian government and the Red Cross and the aid groups on the ground already helped in Latakia over 13,000 families, and there's more. The numbers are, as I said, they're increasing. Aleppo, 22,000 families. In the city of Hama, 11,000 families. Everyone who's thinking about right now, it's not food. Okay, food we're getting from Algeria, from the UAE, from the medical aid, and other countries, Russia, China, and other. But the main question is who's gonna build houses? We cannot build houses. We cannot get the infrastructure of building because, as everyone knows, Syria has sanctions, and the United States and the Western and the world community only lift the sanctions of 180 days. No country on planet Earth can build houses and buildings for 5.5 million people, Syrian people who are homeless. So that's the number one fear for the Syrian people. There is over 600 schools damaged and destroyed completely. Also, that's a big fear for the education system. Today, Syria is... we lived through 12 years of war. Syria, the Syrian army, fought against the radical Islamic terrorist groups funded and supported by the United States and NATO. We are also suffering from COVID. We are suffering from the sanctions on Syria for the last 12 years. So, and then this humanitarian crisis came. So Syria and the Syrian people are still... they have a fear of the future. We don't see any light in the end of the tunnel, as they say, because people are sleeping in tents, in basketball stadiums, in soccer stadiums, in schools. Until when? Like in the end, there's a lot of people, even though their building is unlivable, they're living in it because they have no other choice. The situation on the ground is devastating. And still, the European Union are still afraid, and they are not sending their aid to Damascus. They're sending it to Beirut. And Aleppo has an international airport. Your guest knows that. Latakia has an international airport, and Damascus has an international airport. Italy sent 3 planes full of aid to Beirut airport. Until they come to Latakia and Aleppo, that will take several days. The same thing with Italy. The Greek Prime Minister, after the United States announced that sanctions are lifted, the Greek Prime Minister announced, he said, we cannot help Syria because Syria, there is no government in Damascus. That is a sample of the European and the Western mentality. Today, one plane from Pakistan landed in the airport of Damascus, one from Saudi. Tomorrow, there's a new plane from Saudi, and this is the first plane, just for a notice, that this is the first Saudi plane lands in Syria for the last 12 years. So we have to give them credit that they put their political differences on the side and they put the humanitarian cause in front. We have to give credit for that. 3 planes full of aid from the UNICEF also landed in Syria today in Damascus International Airport. So the country, Algeria, Iraq, all the countries are helping, but the numbers are big. The crisis, there's neighborhoods completely wiped out in Latakia and in Aleppo.
Antoine, let me go to you because I know Aleppo was also hit hard by the earthquake, and you also traveled to different cities to see how different cities were impacted by the earthquake. So tell us what you saw in different cities.
We are talking about a country that have been in one of the most horrible war in history of humankind for the previous 12 years. What I saw, look, I've been living during the war in Syria from the beginning. I didn't leave the country for 1 day. And I was documenting everything in Aleppo, Damascus, the rural side of Homs, Al Jazeera, like the northern eastern part of Syria. I thought before 1 week that I saw everything. I saw ISIS, I saw Al Qaeda, I saw the front, I saw everything. I thought that this is the end and we are going to live a normal life. And after that, the earthquake happened. Now we are talking about the biggest crisis that the country have been through. It's worse than the war. On one day, the last Monday, more than 3.2 million people, they left their house in Aleppo to stay in the street. At the beginning, I thought that it was just a new tunnel, that it was bombed, because I don't know if you know that during the Syrian war, the jihadists, they used to make tunnels under the city and fill it with TNT, and they just bomb it. So I thought it was a dream, but after like few seconds, I discovered that if it was an explosion, it will go for 5 seconds, not more, not less. And I start seeing my house is like our crystal stuff, our books is going down. So for me, I thought that maybe the jihadists, they made something in my neighborhood. You know, it took me like 1 minute to understand what really happening. Not only me, when I talk to my friends, the activists here, the people working in the humanitarian sector, most of them, they all share the same detail. In the beginning, they didn't understand that this is an earthquake. For them, it was just like a flashback to the war. The rural side of Aleppo, you can't imagine the catastrophe there. The rural side of Latakia is the same. We are talking about a crisis that it could change the shape of the country. I'm afraid that in the future, we will face one of the biggest wave of immigration from the rural side to the cities. Because the farmers in Syria, okay, you need to understand that Syria, it was an agricultural country. During the war and because of the sanctions, most of the farmers, they couldn't farm anymore in the same way that it used to be. But they stayed in their lands because they used to have houses there. Now, even this house, it don't exist anymore. There is a lot of bad things going to happen if we don't have real help. These big IDP camps, the internal displaced people, there is a lot of things that I saw that it could lead to human trafficking stuff. People, they are poor. After 12 years of war, we are going through one of our worst time in history. And after that, this crisis happened. I don't know what is next, but I know for sure that if we don't stand together as humans, we are going into a very dark place in history. We are talking about thousands of children that they don't have now schools. And for example, I went through the villages of Hama, going to Latakia through the village of Bet Yashut. I saw 3 villages that they don't have schools anymore. They just don't have schools anymore. Those children, they could be the next Albert Einstein, or they could be a very important people for us, for humans. But now what? Maybe they will become the new wave of jihadists going to Europe or going to anywhere. What we are facing now in Syria, it's not because of the earthquake itself. And we can't put all of our problem on the earthquake. What our real problem is the sanctions itself. I saw myself, and I was on the ground. From that day, the day of the earthquake, till Thursday, I didn't sleep. I was in the street. Some people, they were under the rubble. We were talking to them. After 5 days, there was no sound, and no one came because we don't have a number of qualified people to do. We are talking about a city in Aleppo. The real number of buildings that fall down is more than 50 buildings. We don't have number of ambulance. Our fire force, like our firemen, their headquarters was destroyed during the war by a terrorist attack. The Aleppian civil defense, their headquarters also was destroyed during the war. Our infrastructure is destroyed. And after that, this thing happened. And there is only Algerian, Iraqi, Iranian. They were the only 3 countries that I saw in Aleppo sending sending their crews to earthquake after 2 days. Other countries, they were very afraid of the American bullying. This war is turned to be a very prestigious American high school. And there is the American bully who will always make bad stuff and bad things to the children who don't really hear his voice or do what he wants. What I want to say is the following. Everyone who died during the war, because of hunger, because of the siege, because of a mortar, because of a missile, because of anything, we can say that this blood is on the war itself. Okay? But everyone who died in the earthquake, his blood is on us and on humanity. Anyone who could be survived, but we couldn't be there to help, we were the killers.
خسرت 3 أولاد كنت شايف إنهم مصدق، بس أمر الله لا إله إلا هو. قام ابن عمي قال لي امشي معي على البراد، نزلت ولا علي عند باب البراد على النقالي، لفيته وصرت عيط له قوم يا علي، علي علي ما قام، يا علي قوم، علي ما قام، ولا بيقولوا لي هي نيبال. قلت له شو هي نيبال؟ قال لي هي بنته. خبيت الغطا عن نيبال، طلعت شفت بنتي نيبال حد علي، كل واحد عن نقالي. لقلت النيبال عايشة، قال لا والله ماتت عند دوار الجامعة. لك يا جماعة جسمها سخين ما في. قعدت بين النقالتين وصرت عيط يا نيبال يا علي، يا نيبال يا علي. شوي بتدخل العربي الثالثي، نقالي الثالثي قالوا هيري.
Now we are talking about the sanctions because in the past few days, several countries have been asking the United States to lift the sanctions on Syria to help the Syria who is now having this natural disaster. But we also hear different opinions from the US government officials to European officials, and they say the sanctions do not hamper the deliveries of assistance to Syria. And we also saw this opinion piece published on the Washington Post. The title is "Do Not Lift Sanctions on Syria to Save Earthquake Victims." And the article was written by a Syrian American who used to work as an advisor for the US government. And even to me as a Chinese and outsider, I feel like this is cruel. Where's your humanity? As a Syrian yourself, you're asking countries to not lift the sanctions and punish your own people. And of course, now the United States suspend the sanctions for 180 days. And allegedly will allow more assistance, more help arrive in Syria. But in your opinion, do you think that the suspension of sanctions for 180 days will really help to deal with this dire situation in Syria?
First of all, lifting sanctions off of 180 only for 180 days is a joke, and it's a political game the United States is trying to play. That's number one. Number two, living under sanctions, any Syrian will tell you, not only sanctions. Sanction is one part, but the other part also that is, it completes the sanctions. Even if they put sanctions on us, if they leave us the oil and gas and the wheat in the east of Syria, if the Americans leave the east of Syria and stop occupying and stealing the wheat, the oil and the gas, Syria can build itself, Syria can run its factories, can run the hospitals, the cars, the ambulance, because Syria in 2010 and before the war, it was almost to zero importing from anything. We were producing everything, our food, our everything we were producing. But because of the sanctions, because of the war, and because of the American military being illegally in the east of Syria and stealing the oil and stealing the gas and stealing the wheat, Syria's having to import the wheat for bread, having to import the oil and gas, also to turn for cooking gas and to turn on the electricity and for cars. And because of that, and every 10 ships, the Americans, they hijack like pirates, 2 to 3 ships every time. And sometimes there is not even one ship comes in for a 1 month, 2 months, and we live in a blackout. When Syria sometimes live, and we live in Syria for about 10 minutes of electricity sometimes. 5 minutes of electricity in 24 hours. No one in the 21st century on planet Earth lives on 5 minutes of electricity today. And that is a big role. It's lifting the sanctions off, but also leave the east of Syria, the illegal American being in the oil wells and the gas, and stealing them and giving them to the Kurdish separatists and selling that oil and gas and wheat in the black market to the European Union. And there is proof, and I wrote an article during this war that the wheat of Syria was being sold to France through Turkey. And I wrote that article. And how the Americans, and who's buying the oil and gas from the Americans or before them from the ISIS, who fought the war against ISIS in reality is the Syrian army and the Russian army. It's not the Americans. The Americans, they kept bombing, but who really attacked them and who really finished the ISIS in the east of Syria is the Russians. And the Syrian Air Force, when they targeted the heart of ISIS in the east of Syria, not the Americans. The Americans, they were using it.
Antoine, what about you? What does it like to live under Western sanctions for decades?
Let's see first why the American and the West, they put these sanctions at first. Because for them now, they don't want any part of the world to be a productive part. They want us just to be consumed. When now our wheat is vanished, I don't know if you know that the American, they gave the northern part of Aleppo wheat that it have disease. So we are talking now about a country that it used to be agricultural and very productive industrial country that now only produce like 30% of its real power. The biggest industrial city in Syria, it was Aleppo. Now the industrial part of Aleppo is closed because what the Americans want, they want us to be consumers. And if you ask one question, like the sanctions on Syria is come from two parts. The first part that you can take money because we are out of the SWIFT system, and this is what they stopped for 180 days. The other part is that you can't import any equipment that it has more than 40% of an American ships or American technology or any kind of an American copyrighted technology. Do you think that sending money to Syria will rebuild Syria? No, it will not. Need a lot of money. Okay, I know, I understand that very well. The number of poor people in the street, the hunger, I understand very well. But give us our humanitarian right to be productive people. We used to be in the country that it was the biggest exporter of olive oil. Now there is no olive oil in Syria. Like everyone now is focusing on what happened in the earthquake. But if you want to see it in a strategic way, the earthquake in Aleppo destroyed the water supply system. The water infrastructure in Aleppo, now it's stopped. Can you imagine 4-5 million people living in a city without water? And do you think that this thing could be handled by just sending help through like food packets to Syria? No. Even our educational system now, every year Coursera give 4,500 free access to all of its courses to Syrians. But if you have a Syrian IP, you will be blocked. Before in the time of the sanction, the financial sanction that is published a few days ago, if me and Steven, I was living in Germany and he living in Holland, and I sent him money, in the caption of the money, or in the definition of the money, I put Aleppo, Latakia, Damascus. Our two banks account will be blocked because they will be suspicious. Yeah, they will suspect that I'm supporting terrorism. So now our nationality, our culture, our honor is a stigma. They want us to stop being Syrian. After all of this blood that we gave, maybe the only solution for them is to another earthquake or a nuclear bombing to Syria to just we can vanish.
And my last question is, as a Syrian, what kind of future do you want?
I want to have kids. I want to raise them here. I want to have normal problems in my life. I want to be afraid that my son will be, for example, addicted to social media, and this will be my biggest fear. Not my biggest fear that I will not have medicine for my father in the next days. I want to live as a normal human with I can take care of my needs. I will have a beloved wife and beloved children, take them to school, going to the good garden, take them to the beach. That's it. As Syrian, we don't want less. We just want to live a normal life, a happy life. Okay, it will have a little bit of normal sadness, but we just want to be a normal human on this normal planet, having our normal life. That's it. We don't want to be afraid of the future, and we don't want anyone to change us, to change our values, or to change our culture, so they will accept us.
Thank you, Antoine. And what about you, Stephen?
Actually, my dream and the majority of the Syrian, their dream is for their future, if we can just go back to 2010, before the war. Everything was cheap in Syria. You can go out of your house anytime you want. Even like in Syria before the war, no one traveled in the morning. Everyone traveled between the cities at 3, 4 a.m., 2 a.m. because there was so much security. Everything was cheap. We had normal, as Antoine said, we want normal problems, and that's what we had before the war. We hardly imported anything. We ate from what we grew. Aleppo was the capital of industry in the whole region, not only in Syria. The countries from other Arab countries, they were coming to Aleppo to see the factories, how big they are and how advanced they are. And we were sending to Europe and to all over the world. That's the Syria we want. And if the sanctions are lifted right now and the Americans leave our oil wells, we can make Syria again like that, even with no help. We can do it, because who build it one time, they can build it a second time and third time. And we have the ability, we have the mind, and we have the money. But right now, the Americans are stealing our money. That's what we want, normal life. I shouldn't be afraid, as Antoine, I shouldn't be afraid about sending my child to school. I shouldn't be afraid if as I said in previous interview, I used to walk hours to find baby milk from my own baby because of the sanctions. They cannot get it that easily to Syria. The same thing with Pampers. The same thing with medicine, with everything. In Syria before the war, we were sorry. The electricity won't go off. Our 10 minutes are over. 1 second.
Your electricity.
Okay, I got the battery.
The electricity went off a minute ago because of the lack of electricity in Syria, because you have a limitation of using the electricity.
The lack of electricity. Yes, because there's no fuel to turn on the electric electric generators from the government. They don't have enough fuel. If we had our oil wells in the east of Syria, we used to have 24 hours of electricity before the war. We never lived through something like this. Electricity turning off and getting 10 minutes of electricity. Now we're living through this in this 12 years of war. Because of the sanctions, as I said, and the same thing with hospitals. The same thing with schools, with older people. Not everyone can afford a battery. Not everyone can afford a generator. Not everyone can have access to some gasoline to turn on their generator. There's some people, we're in the 21st century, and there's people today in Syria using candles because they cannot afford anything else. There's Syrian students studying on candles because the American the White House in Washington D.C. and the foreign policy, they cannot stand anyone to tell them no, and they want the whole world to be on their side, and they don't like the people, the government in Damascus. So let's suffer 25 to 30 million people just because of our difference of policy.
Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you so much for sharing your experience. I'm so sorry for what happened to you, but I hope that that we all join together and fight against this hegemony, this very, very unfair sanctions on countries like Syria. And I hope one day we can change this situation for the whole world, and hope we have a peaceful world, peaceful future, that we can all have a normal life. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Well, thank you.
Most of the people in the world are told by the Western mainstream media, by the Western government officials, that Syria is under the rule of a ruthless dictator. Most of the people in the world are taught to hate President Assad. So in order to overthrow the government, the West decided to punish ordinary Syrian civilians collectively with their sanctions, let them starve, struggle, while they tell to the world that they care about human rights. I'm going to show you a speech revealing how the US, allied with terrorists, intentionally created the chaos in Syria. The speech was given by the former head of the Criminal Law Division at the Pentagon, a veteran soldier and a US Marine who fought in numerous combats for US wars. He is Colonel Richard Black. He heavily criticized the US increasingly extreme foreign policies, especially the US role in the Ukraine crisis, its war in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and Syria. He previously was on my show as well, revealing how the US created the illusion of Chinese and Russian aggression. If you want to check my interview with Colonel Richard Black, you can come to my channel or search both my name, Li Jingjing, and Richard Black's name on YouTube. You will find all the videos. And now, let's hear Colonel Richard Black explains the truth about the Syrian crisis in his own words.
We're told that we're fighting a war on terror, but we're not. We're closely allied with terrorists like Al-Qaeda in an endless quest to destroy Arab civilizations throughout the Middle East. Few Americans can even name all of our wars: Serbia, Iraq, Libya, Syria, Yemen, Somalia, Ukraine. None of them attacked us. We attacked all of them. Just look at the case of Syria. Remember what Syria once was? Before the war, Syria had a nicely balanced economy. It produced most of its own industrial goods, produced its fuel and agricultural products, had very little poverty and enjoyed thriving trade, and it was financially responsible. It had enjoyed 40 years of peace with Israel, and the constitution drafted under President Assad guarantees equal rights for women, and importantly, it guarantees religious freedom in 3 different parts of the text. I read it. Syria is a model for other Arab states, especially ones like Saudi Arabia, which have no constitution at all. We call Syria's president a dictator, but in 2014, he was overwhelmingly elected by the people of Syria in a fair and free election. It was very heavily monitored. There were lots of observers, all agreed that it had been a true and valid election. So Syria is a model of elective democracy, if you want to call it that, for the Arab world. But the Americans pretend that the election never happened. And yet many Syrians who spent 15 hours in the blazing sun so that they could vote for President Assad were targeted and killed by US-backed rebels who fired mortars into their midst and killed them. Now, after 10 years of war, I think it's important to recognize, after 10 years of war, not a single rebel leader has ever emerged as a popular figure with the West loves the terrorists that the people of Syria despise. You know, we're taught to hate President Assad because he cracked down on rioters in 2011, and they say that he gassed his people. But that's not true, because we decided to attack Syria 10 years before all of that. In 2001, Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld ordered the Pentagon to draft plans to overthrow 7 countries in the Mideast, beginning with Iraq, then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off with Iran. Not one of them had harmed the United States. In 2006, the U.S. Embassy in Damascus drew up detailed plans to destabilize and overthrow Syria. Those were widely disseminated to the Pentagon, to various unified commands. They went to NATO. They went widely across the world. The specific plans to destabilize and overthrow Syria, and that was long before any demonstrations had ever occurred in Syria. And yet we claim them as the reason that we opposed President Assad. In 2011, also during the Arab Spring, the highly secretive Central Intelligence Agency Special Activities Center sent paramilitary teams into the sovereign territory of Syria to identify, train, equip, and lead terrorists to overthrow the Syrian government. In 2013, Barack Obama formalized this long-standing support for anti-Syrian terrorists by secretly authorizing CIA program Timber Sycamore. Under program Timber Sycamore, the CIA's Special Operations Division trained, armed, and paid thousands of terrorists to fight against Syria. Those armies totally under our control. And in one case, a group in Aleppo, we had paid over 1,000 of their people salaries, given them arms, given them training. And it wasn't until they kidnapped a small Palestinian boy who was being treated in a hospital. They kidnapped him, they took him to the central square in Aleppo. And in order to terrorize the people into not fleeing Aleppo, which was being cordoned off by Syrian troops, they took him to the center in a pickup truck. They grabbed the little boy by the hair. They took a knife and they slashed his head off. And then they paraded it. They held it up and waved it in front of the crowd as a warning. Don't escape from Aleppo. We paid the salaries of every man who held that boy's head aloft. We gave them their weapons. We gave them their truck. We gave them everything that they needed. And it was only after that very gruesome incident that we decided, well, that's an embarrassment. We better not pay them. We have been paying terrorists like this throughout the war. NATO and the United States have maintained an intense propaganda campaign against Syria from the outset. Sarin gas attacks that killed civilians were blamed on President Assad. But not one reporter ever asked why Assad would use gas against children, but not against armies of terrorists bearing down on the capital of Damascus. The reason is obvious. There is no answer for that. And the journalists are smart enough to know that if they ask that question, their career in journalism is finished. Secretary of Defense James Mattis admitted in 2018 that the U.S. had no evidence that Assad had ever used sarin gas. Two courageous Turkish members of parliament were quickly accused of treason after they revealed an indictment, a criminal indictment, that showed how an al-Qaeda cell had infiltrated 2.2 kilos of sarin gas across the border from Turkey for use in Syria, most likely going to Damascus for the initial attack that was the red line attack that almost sent American troops into Syria. So why do we attack Syria? Well, there are a number of reasons. Part of it ties in with Israeli foreign policy. But the U.S. also seeks to capture oil and gas routes serving Saudi Arabia. In addition to pipeline access, Saudi Arabia has an intense desire to impose harsh Wahhabi Islam on the religiously harmonious Syrians. The Turks cast a greedy eye on the industrial city of Aleppo. The Turks also want to capture the oil and the agricultural produce of the nation that is produced in northern Syria. So there are many people who have these desires, and there are many reasons behind the war. Certainly, the American arms dealers profit immensely from the lucrative deals like the 600 BMP-71 anti-tank missiles that the Central Intelligence Agency rushed to al-Qaeda in 2014 to prepare them to attack across the Turkish border. It was only with those CIA provided anti-tank weapons that the al-Qaeda terrorists were able to break through the Syrian armor and the Syrian lines and seize the beautiful town of Kasab and behead the Christians who were there and all of the churches, and then smash ancient tombstones with sledgehammers. That was done thanks to the CIA. Al-Qaeda never could have broken the Syrian lines without those anti-tank missiles. Many of these terrorist groups have sworn to behead the Christians and the Alawites and to make sex slaves of their wives and daughters. One jihadist famously drove his American-made Humvee into battle with a naked slave girl lashed to his windshield. And he knew that the Syrian soldiers would hesitate to shoot at his Humvee as long as there was an innocent girl lashed to the windshield. And then that's why he used it. That's why he put this poor girl up there and drove her first into battle as his shield. In 2015, U.S. troops illegally invaded northern Syria and unlawfully seized Syria's oil. We authorized an American oil company to build a refinery for $150 million and to drill for more oil on sovereign Syrian land. Before the war, Syria never needed oil or natural gas because it was still self-sufficient. It exported a little bit, but it was not a big oil-producing country. But what was important is that it provided all of the fuel, all of the gasoline, all of the heating fuel for the power plants and so forth in Syria. But now, the legacy of the nation has been stolen by the United States, leaving Syrians to freeze to death in the winter as we steal their fuel. The same region, northern Syria, is the breadbasket of the country. It grew enough wheat to feed the entire nation, to export a little bit, but this too has been stolen. We gave it to the Kurds who are shipping Syrian wheat to Turkish merchants, while Syrian peasants starve. To tighten the noose on Syria, Secretary Mike Pompeo bragged about cutting Syria off from sources of currency and blockading oil tankers arriving from Iran. He's right. We've caused immense death, disease, and suffering for poor Syrians. Americans are routinely reminded that we're not targeting common people, only the leaders. Rubbish. That's a total lie. Sanctions do nothing but attack the innocent, the poor, the helpless. They are the most cruel and barbaric type of warfare that we can wage. We steal food, fuel, and medicine from the poor. We blockade supplies for rebuilding so that Syrian men must fight for a living or starve. If we ended the blockade, they could work rebuilding the country. Syrians are tired of war. We've imposed 10 years of war on them. They want to rebuild. The young men, the time that fighting wars was exotic is over. They want to go home. They want to build families. They want to rebuild their homes and their businesses. But the United States blockades all materials necessary for rebuilding, so that young Syrian men must fight for a living or starve. As it is, the only work is fighting, which will go on as long as we continue funding it. The world must reject for 10 years against the Syrians, but we've oppressed the Iraqi people for 30 years. We've dropped over 250,000 bombs on Iraq, and we bombed them even while we sit in military base camps occupying the country. This madness must stop.